Well, I was born on July 4th, 1943 in Roseburg, Oregon. My father was a Nazarene minister there, and it was during World War II, and he worked at the Veterans Hospital there in Roseburg. My brother and I were close to 2 and 2.5 years old when we moved back from Roseburg to Ashland. And our grandparents had come to Ashland in the last covered wagon group from Nebraska across on the Applegate Trail. So our family ties in Ashland went back quite a few years. So it was there that we received our foundation in schooling, attending Ashland Public Schools, and subsequently going on to what is now called Southern Oregon University. At that time it was called Southern Oregon College. I was always interested in politics, but it was after I was married and settled down that my wife threw the challenge to me one time when I viewed a local school board decision, and I felt that I could have made a better decision. And my wife said, if you feel like you're better, why don't you run? And so I did. And I lost the election by 11 votes. And subsequently, then I ran for the Oregon State Senate in 1974. And out of close to 25,000 votes that were cast, won the election by 48 votes. And there was a recount 30 days later because of the mandatory 1% of the vote count, and I actually lost one vote in the recount. I won the election by 47 votes. And so it was there in January 1975 when I was sworn into the Oregon State Senate. I felt like I could make a change in the direction of the state, use ideas and suggestions that I had in wanting to see change brought about in state government. I think if anything that has crossed my mind over the years, the things that were of significance and importance during that time frame in the early 1970s, those same issues somehow pertain today, and they go from the gambit of school finance, land use planning, workers' compensation, tax reform, health care. Those are issues that we were debating back in those days, and there seem to be debating now in the 21st century. In 1974, Oregonians were under an expenditure limitation. The 1973 legislature had enacted an expenditure limitation, and you could only spend 25 cents per registered voter in your district. And so for the primary and general election combined, I could only spend about $7,500. And so back in those days, it was more concerned with the organization that you had. And I had a lot of labor organizations that supported my original campaign and my candidacy. But basically, my campaign organization was my wife, my brother, who had come home from attending law school in Sacramento, California, to stay with my parents and run my campaign full time. And at that time, my 72-year-old father and myself, and the four of us went door-to-door campaigning. We knocked on doors in Jackson County, and in Klamath County. So the Senate district back in 1974 comprised about 2/3 of Jackson County and about 1/3 of Klamath County. I probably should be taking that advice today. I attended a meeting one time, and I wasn't wearing a coat and tie. I was wearing a golf shirt, and Senator Potts said, "Young man, if you want to be treated like a senator, then act like one, talk like one, and dress like one. And that means wear a coat and tie." And subsequently then on, I never appeared at a public function unless I was wearing a coat and tie. So he gave me very pertinent information, and I admired Senator Potts a great deal, and cherish his memory with me forever. You know, it was an awesome group of individuals. We had a camaraderie back in those days when you could look a fellow senator in the eye, shake their hands, and go to the bank on it. It was that good. Their word was their bond. I think today sometimes we're lacking that same integrity that we had with those individuals. Governor Kulongoski, when he was in the state senate with me, we didn't always agree on things, but boy, we respected each other. And we worked together, where we could put our issues aside and work for the best interest of the public. We did so. And we put public interest above personal interest or personal gain. And I think many times today we need to revert to some of those old-fashioned standards of shaking a person's hand, looking them in the eyeball, and say, "You can go to the bank on my word." The people you listed off there, Senator Meeker went on to become state treasurer. Senator Hartung served 4 decades in the Senate. Bill McCoy was the first African American elected to the House and then subsequently to the Senate. Senator Kulongoski went on to become Director of Business Insurance under Neil Goldschmidt's administration. He subsequently wound up on the Supreme Court and ultimately became governor of the state of Oregon. Those were people whose integrity, both Republican and Democrat, worked for the public's interest, not their self-serving interest. And so when I look back with fond memories of all of those individuals, I hold them in very high esteem. I respect them, and I cherish our friendship that we have till this day. Several things have occurred. One is the initiative process. The initiative process has been used and abused by those people who want to second-guess the legislature at every angle. They have used the initiative process to make the Oregon legislature a super school board, for the state of Oregon rather than a legislative body. They have used the process to require term limitations, thereby evicting some of the most seasoned members of the legislature, both Democrat and Republican. They have used the initiative process to limit the legislature's flexibility on the things that they can spend for and cannot spend for. And so using the combination of these three things, plus throwing in the continual second guessing by the initiative process, has served to terminate what is in the best interest of the public and revert to a dogma of what is Democratic or what is Republican. And issues are decided many times, unfortunately, today on the basis of what is in the best interest of the Democrats or what is in the best interest of the Republicans, rather what is in the best interest of the public. And I feel like we need to reverse our course of action. We can talk about updating our legislative assembly. We can talk about modernizing our legislative assembly. But I think what we need to do is really get back to the old-fashioned thing, and that's called basics. We have a constitutional responsibility in this state through the legislative process, and that is to develop a 2-year budget and go home. It doesn't say that you're there to do this or that, or be a super school board. The Constitution clearly states that your constitutional function is to adopt a 2-year budget and go home. And I think what we need to understand is that when we change the dynamics of funding education in this state and took it off the property tax and put it in the co-mix of state general funds, at that very moment we started jeopardizing the integrity of state government. We jeopardized higher education. We jeopardized human resources. We jeopardized community corrections. We have jeopardized natural resources. All these functions were the sole responsibility of state government. And now, funding of schools is the #1 responsibility of state government. That was never the intention of the forefathers of our Constitution in the state of Oregon. First of all, I think the way to fix it or to address it is to bring in a blue ribbon committee consisting of business leaders, labor, housewives, fathers, teachers, educators, and just senior citizens. And they need to sit down and be empowered with the ability to make recommendations that the legislature would be able to act upon. We are trying to balance state government and the funding of our schools through 2 legs of a stool. One leg is property taxes. One leg is a little longer and it's state income taxes. We need a third source of revenue and then balance all three of those legs out so that the stool isn't rocking one way or the other. I think it's time to stabilize what we talk about funding education in this state. Are we serious about finding a solution and getting the funding of education out of the limited, finite resources of the state general fund? We have seen the jeopardy of state police. In 1980, Oregonians were sold on Senate Joint Resolution 7. You vote to take the state police out of ODOT, and we'll put them in the general fund. There's plenty of money in there. They won't unionize, and we'll have a happy home hereafter. This is now 2006. We have less troopers than we had on the highway in 1980 when Oregonians were sold a simplistic, complex solution. These are the kinds of things we need leadership on. We need leadership in the legislature. We need leadership in the communities. And we need leadership in the governor's office to say it's time for a change. And let's get back to basics in this state. Until we are willing to grapple with some of those difficult dilemmas, we only placate the problem and rub the solutions rather than finding solutions. Well, in 1974, I was elected as a Democrat, and in 1978, I was reelected as a Democrat. In 1980, the Democratic Party held a platform committee meeting in Medford, Oregon. At that time, they advocated legalizing prostitution, marijuana, gun control, and said I think abortion was also included in there. And they said, if you don't embrace this, we won't embrace you. And I said, well, I prefer you not even touch me. So I went down and I changed my registration on February 14th, 1980, Statehood Day. I was chairman of the Senate Trade and Economic Development Committee. I served on the Senate Revenue Committee, and by 5 o'clock that night I'd been fired as chairman of the committees by Senate President Jason Bowe. All my things had been put in cardboard boxes and moved out of my office. I lost my committee assignments. I lost my office, and I lost my parking spot, and started at the bottom of the heap all over again in February 14th, 1980. And then subsequently was elected 6 times as a Republican. You know, it's interesting. I think one of the most dynamic persons at the time has gone on to become a legend in folklore in state government, but Governor Tom McCall. He said, "What you see is what you get." I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I'm an Oregonian. And I think one of the greatest things that I have in my bedroom in my home is a plaque up on the wall, and it's John F. Kennedy. And people will probably find that amusing as a Republican, having John F. Kennedy paraphernalia in my room. But John F. Kennedy came to Ashland in 1960 when he was running for President of the United States. And our band was playing at the activity, and then Senator John F. Kennedy came walking through. Our entire band shook hands with every one of us. And then he went on and he gave his famous inaugural speech about asking not what your country could do for you, but asking what you could do for your country. And I would say dynamically, between one Republican and one Democrat, Tom McCall, John F. Kennedy, had the greatest impact on my life, because they showed me what you could do as a citizen who was willing to answer the call to public service. And that I have to say is my greatest attribute, that I lay claim to those people as guiding interests in my life. My very first session in 1975, my brother, who had successfully ran my campaign, came up and was my legislative assistant. Dixie stayed at home here in Salem in a 3-bedroom apartment that we had, and she watched 4 of our children and another senator's 3 children. So she had 7 children in a 3-bedroom apartment. That was 1975. Legislative salary back in those days, interesting enough, was about $300 a month, $350 a month for the Legislative Assembly. And the per diem was, I think, $35 a day. In 1977, Dixie asked me if she could be my legislative assistant, and I said no. I said, it's not really going to work. I said, we'll come home, we'll be tense, we want to discuss everything at home, and it just won't work. She said, let me try it. So I said, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. Let's be man and woman enough to try it. But let's also be man and woman enough to know that if it doesn't work, we won't do it again, and we'll recognize what the problems are rather than creating a problem that we don't need in our relationship and our marriage. She started in 1977, and she worked for me for my entire legislative career. Not only could I not have done it without her total support, but she was my wife, she was my legislative assistant, she was the mother of our children, and she did all these things above and beyond the call of duty. And so it is a great attribute to have a wife and a family that you can call your own. Our 5 children all worked in the legislature, and the oldest daughter and son and Nick's daughter worked in the House as pages in different times. The youngest daughter worked as a page in the House, and our 4th daughter worked for me in my legislative office for one session. And so all 5 of them worked in the Legislative Assembly. They all came to the same conclusion, that they were not interested or characterized or built to become politicians, so subsequently did not become engaged in political activities. But today, if you ask them, each one in their own individual way is astute on the issues and who the parties are and who the leaders are and what the issues are. So it was a good learning curve for all of them, and I think a good experience for all 5 of the children. I've been asked many times by people what I would lay as my greatest claim to fame in the legislature, and I have told them there's not one particular issue that I can lay my hat on and say this is mine above other things. But there's been a variety and many issues of things. But the thing that meant the most to me was in 1975, my very first session, I started receiving a letter that was handwritten every other week. And it was delivered to my office, including newspaper clippings of speeches or statements or actions that I had taken over my legislative career. And it happened up until about 5 years before I left office, when this person passed away. But this person was my 3rd grade teacher, and she would always write handwritten notes of encouragement, and she would always finish a letter by saying, "I still can't believe that that's that quiet little boy that used to sit in the back of my classroom in the 3rd grade." But she was a great instrument of support, challenging me to look beyond, challenged me to raise my horizons, challenging me to always look above for solutions. And I think if anything that I can point to in my 29 plus years in the Oregon State Senate was looking back at her involvement and her contributions that she played in my life. You know, it's interesting that when I was cleaning out my office at the end of my term and I had left, that a lot of the things that I had kept over the years, paper clippings, editorials, issues, subjects that were debated, back in the 1970s were the very same issues that were being discussed and debated today. They were in a different context, in a different form, but basically they were of the same issues. And so I think that as we proceed in time, some things always remain constant, and some things remain change and flux. And the things that change and in flux are the way that we look at each other. The things that remain constant are the issues. The issues remain the same, and probably will. Well, I think it was a tremendous opportunity for the legislature to show the public in the state of Oregon that we could indeed put partisanship aside and work for the best interests of Oregonians. My respect and admiration for Senator Courtney goes back to when I first met him and he came to the legislature. Senator Courtney brings a great deal of knowledge, background, and commitment to the legislative process. When the vote in 2002 evenly divided the Senate, 15 Democrats and 15 Republicans, it was my honor and my privilege to be able to represent the Republicans in negotiations with the Democrats. And subsequently, the Democrats said that they could trust me, and the Republicans said that they could trust Senator Courtney. And so it came as an opportunity for both of us to put partisanship aside and work together. Now there's another unknown that people are not aware of, that in the fall of 2002 in Portland, former Governor Neil Goldschmidt put on a fundraiser for two senators. One was Peter Courtney and the other one was Lenn Hannon. And it was held jointly on the same night at the same hotel, in the same room. And business community came together and they represented support for Senator Courtney and myself. And so our relationship started long before 2003 session, but was nurtured during that process. Given the circumstance where you had one partisan body, the Republicans, controlling the House of Representatives and the Senate evenly divided, I think it was a success, because we were able to meet our obligation of responsibly planning a budget, balancing the budget, and going home. There's several bills that I'm proud of my participation in. One is a bill that I sponsored to put tags on beer kegs. So when a beer keg is sold at a tavern and college kids wound up with a underage drinking party and there was this ID on the beer keg, they could trace back who purchased the beer and provided the beer to underage drinkers. That is one. Another example is allowing visually impaired people or blind people to serve on jury duty in the state of Oregon. My grandfather on my dad's side was blind from the age of 36 on, and he never felt that he could be a full citizen because he was never allowed to participate in the jury process. So I introduced a bill that said visually impaired people could serve on juries, providing there was no evidence that they would have to be visually seen, and subject to challenge by attorneys on both sides. Visually impaired people, National Federation of Blind, honored me with an award for sponsoring that legislation, and I really felt very honored by it. I think we all have regrets. If I had a regret, it would be a regret for not being able to find a permanent solution to school finance. I've always been a strong advocate and supporter for schools, and it's troubled me greatly that we haven't been able to find a permanent solution for funding schools. And schools are still on this roller coaster. They had their highs and their lows, and to me, it's a responsibility that I took very seriously every time I was sworn into the legislature, was to work and find a solution for funding schools. That's the first thing that I would have regret on. The second regret, if I had, was that I was never perhaps vocal enough for minorities. When I say that, I mean people of sexual orientation, people who are different than myself. And if I have a regret there, is maybe I didn't speak loud enough. I spoke on behalf of their issues, but sometimes maybe I could have or should have or would have spoken louder. And so that's a regret. Otherwise than that, I feel very fulfilled in my experience in the Legislative Assembly. After the 2003 session, where the Senate was evenly divided, 15-15, I just felt that I knew it was going to change in the Senate. And I had served for close to 30 years. And I felt it was time to move on and provide another voice and another chapter in my position of trying to help state government. The governor came and asked me if I would serve on this board, and I said yes. And I served on there till health precluded me from continuing because of my smoking. A lot of people in the Senate knew that I had my famous smoking window in the back of the Senate chamber, that if you ever wanted to find Lenn Hannon during Senate sessions, you could go back there and find him standing in front of his smoking window having a smoke. So I would probably still be on the Parole Post-Prison Supervision Board today if my health had not deteriorated over the last several months. My mother, God rest her soul, attended Southern Oregon University when it was called Southern Oregon Normal School in 1930. Southern Oregon College actually became a state institution in 1929. So my family legacy in the institution had gone back almost to the early existence of Southern Oregon College. But it was Southern Oregon Normal School back in those days. It was a teacher school, and so my mom was studying to become a teacher when she met my father, and they became engaged and were married. Subsequently, my brother went to Southern Oregon in the 1960s and graduated from Southern Oregon, and he ran for student body president there at Southern Oregon. Also, in addition to that, is the fact that my wife and I both attended Southern Oregon, and that's where we met each other. So Southern Oregon has been part of our family tradition for a long time. Two of our daughters have graduated from Southern Oregon, so you can say it's a generational thing that we've gone through the time and period of graduating from Southern Oregon. When the university came to me and asked me for some help in securing some funding for their library building, I participated along with our legislative delegation in securing the funding for the library. And the president of the university and the Board of Higher Education bestowed an honor upon my wife and I by naming it the Lenn and Dixie Hannon Library. And it's a very special place in our heart, and will always be that way. You know, I think it was Governor Tia that had a slogan through the Department of Economic Development, and it said, "Oregon, things look different here." And they really do. The people are different. They're an independent lot. The people are generous. They're a caring, giving lot. People are expecting their leaders to respond to their needs, and so they have participation in government. In Oregon, we have the three branches of government: the legislative, judicial, and the executive branch. But there's a fourth branch of government, and that is the people. And by exercising the initiative procedure, they sway and they carry as much weight as the other three branches of government. Only in Oregon, when the initiative process was created, was this process available. Other states have tried to replicate Oregon. Other states have tried to duplicate Oregon, but have fallen short of being able to reach that horizon that Oregon has placed itself upon. Oregon was the very first state with the beach bill. Oregon was the first state in the nation with the bottle bill. Oregon was the first state in the nation with land use planning. And so when they use the statement, Oregon, things look different here, we really are different. You know, that's an interesting question about what my perception of the legislative process is, because as I've been able to travel around to different states and meet with legislators from different areas, several things arise from legislators from other states. The first thing that arises is, oh, you're from Oregon. Isn't that where the governor said, come and visit but don't stay? That's the first thing people say about Oregon. The second thing people say about legislators from Oregon is, gee, you have such an innovative and creative system. You're the first in this, and the first in this, and the first in this. How do you get such ideas to expand concepts into new innovations? And then the third thing that they tell us is, Oregon, boy, you're so squeaky clean, there's nothing wrong with your political system. Because you have a strong ethics rule, you have a strong reporting standards, and you look at legislators from New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and it's the kind of government that you buy. And yet Oregon is unique. It's clean, it's open, and it's responsive. So I would say with those three things are always highlighted to me as I travel around and you look at legislators from other states. People want to find out, how do you do this in Oregon? How can we do this in our state? And so other states look to Oregon as a leader in education, a leader in healthcare, a leader in corrections, a leader in education, a lot of things that Oregon takes pride in. Other states look upon Oregon in an envious light. That's interesting, because as Oregon become easier or more difficult to govern, as the initiative process has been used, as I stated earlier, it's probably been more difficult to govern, because it's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback and try to second guess what the legislature intended or didn't intend to occur. A group out of Atlanta, Georgia, called Scientific Games Incorporated put up the first $500,000 to create the Oregon lottery. They paid people to circulate petitions, and the people passed 2 ballot measures when they created the lottery. One was the creation of the lottery and lottery games. The second was defining lottery proceeds to be used for economic development. Now, if you go out of here on the street today and talk to men and women and children, they think that the lottery was A, created by the legislature, B, the money all goes to education, and C, that this big monolithic structure is part of state government that was somehow created to raise taxes through a backdoor approach. And all three of them are wrong. It was created by a private company that said on their ballot measure that the first ticket had to be sold within 180 days. There was only one company that met the scientific criteria to have scratch off lottery tickets in 180 days. That was called Scientific Games Incorporated of Atlanta, Georgia. So on the first $500,000 they put up to pay for the initiative, they received a net proceed of $1 million yield on their money. So, is it more difficult? yeah, it's difficult with special interests coming in and trying to manipulate the initiative process rather than the citizens utilizing the initiative process for their own benefit. First, I think what we need to do is look at the initiative process. I'm not interested in removing anybody's right to govern, but I think what you have to do is look at how special interests groups from around the country have come into Oregon and tried to utilize the initiative process for their own self-serving gain rather than what is in the best public interest of Oregonians. And so I think that whole concept needs to be reevaluated and processed on who has access to the initiative process. Paying people to gather petition signatures isn't democracy. That's vote buying. In the 1965 legislative session, Oregon legislators appropriated what was called basic school support. And it was a 2-year appropriation for monies for schools K through 12 in the state of Oregon, and that money was supposed to be used to offset local property taxes. In 1965, that amount of money totaled $64 million for a 2-year period. In 2005, the legislature appropriated $5.2 billion. So in 1965 at $64 million to 2005 at $5.2 billion. Tell me we're not somehow appropriating more money than what people think during that course of time. And how is that money being used? And I think there will never be enough money to fund education. There will never be enough. And so what you have to do is ask the questions. What are we receiving in value for the amount of dollars that we invest in education? Is it dollar for dollar value? Is it dollar for 50-cent value? Is it dollar for 25 cents in value? We have to ask those questions, and we need those answers. And quite frankly, in all these years, I don't think we've ever had those answers. I would say the most humbling floor speech I've ever given was one that dealt with some budget reductions we were having to make during our many special sessions in 2002. And I was arguing against making some of the budget reductions, and I said, I am my brother's keeper. And I think it's important for legislators to be reminded themselves that we are there to do what those that cannot do for themselves. And therefore we are our brother's keepers. We are there to look out for their interests, to make sure that those that have not have, and make sure that people are treated with sensitivity, with dignity, and with honor. I think you look back in the 1960s and you see a coming together of the legislature for land use planning, the state of Oregon, Senate Bill 100. You see the first bottle bill sponsored by Representative Paul Hannon and others. You see the first beach bill that was sponsored and passed. These are coming together of legislative actions, both Democrat and Republican, for what is in the best interests of Oregonians, not what is in the best interests of the party. And so I look at episodes like that and point to them and I say, see, it can be done if you put your partisanship aside. And that's where it's very valuable to do so. You can be a Democrat. You can be a Republican. But you can also be an Oregonian. And an Oregonian rises above politics. And an Oregonian bases it upon principle, not politics. When I was in the legislature, I used a binder. Each day my third reading was prepared with each bill in there, along with a revenue analysis and a fiscal analysis. If there was a fiscal impact or a revenue impact, it was included in there with the bill. I would take the binder with me down on the floor, and I would already have marked ahead of time, yes, no, maybe, ask some questions. There would be a variety of reasons for all those things. And the reason I would do that is because a legislator might get confronted by a lobbyist who says, this is the way the bill should be, this is the way the bill will impact your constituency, and your constituency supports this bill. Not always do you have time to call each one of your constituents and say, do you support this bill? And many times people will write and say, I want you to vote yes on such and such a bill. But they fail to recognize that that bill has been amended so many times from its original version that it could mean something totally different, or some totally abhorrent bill to what the original bill intended to be. That we need to always be open, and we always need to be receptive to change, to understand, is that bill the same bill that was introduced? Does it have the public support? And how is it going to impact my constituents that I represent? I'm reminded in 1975, I was invited out to the Lifers Club out at the Oregon State Penitentiary. And they put me in a room there and they started grilling me and asking me questions of, did I support this or did I oppose that? And I said, at the risk of being kicked out of here by you guys, I said, I'm going to tell you something. First of all, you're all offenders that are incarcerated in prison. You're all criminals. Neither one of you have the right to vote. You people in this room did not put me in office. The people that put me in office are back home working an 8 to 5 shift or a 5 to midnight hour shift, working to support their family, abiding by the laws. They're the ones that sent me here. And if you think they sent me here to give you more rights and privileges than them that are working and abiding by the rules, then you need to understand where I'm coming from. So I think it's important to understand that many times legislators go into a group and promise and say and do things based upon what that particular group wants to hear, rather than what is right and how are you going to conduct yourself to carry it out. The best advice I would give you is look towards organizing a campaign. Organize a net group, a committee of supporters that you can bounce ideas off of. You can say, this is how I feel about this. This is how I feel about this. This is how I feel about this. But never be too rigid in your application of positions on issues that you're not willing to change. Be receptive to change, because the fact remains that you don't have all the answers, because if you did, you'd bottle them and sell them. So give the other person the right of understanding where you're coming from, but give them the courtesy to also understand where they're coming from, that maybe they have a better idea on an issue than you do. In 1974, AFL-CIO in the state of Oregon contributed money to my campaign. In the 1975 session, my wife and I were taken out to dinner by the first vice president of AFL-CIO. And this particular individual had been drinking prior to our arrival there for dinner. And this person was sitting there, and he said, you know, Senator, he says, we put a lot of money in your campaign. And I said, well, I appreciate that. My naivete was beginning to show through. So he says, you know, Senator, he says, we were responsible for having you appointed Vice Chairman of Senate Labor Committee. And I said, well, I'm certainly not aware of that, but if you did, I appreciate it. He says, you know, Senator, he says, we haven't asked you for a thing. And I said, no, you haven't. He said, well, now we're telling you. On a 5-4 vote, you're killing our bills in your Senate Labor Committee. And tomorrow morning on a 5-4 vote, we expect those bills to start coming out of that committee with your support. Well, I took my wife's hand. We'd stood up, we'd just been served dinner salad. And I said, if you'll excuse us, I said, tomorrow morning I'm going to go down to the bank and I'm going to draw out a personal loan for the exact amount of money you people contributed to my campaign. I said, you didn't buy me, you don't own me, and you don't tell me how I'm going to vote on an issue. And with that, Dixie and I left and went back to our apartment. We gathered our children around and we told them what had occurred. We prayed about it. The next morning, went down to the bank, drawed out a personal loan from our savings account in Ashland for $500, and I had it converted into a cashier's check. Stuck inside of an envelope was this check, and I brought it back across the street to the Oregon State Senate. Under remonstrances, I stood up, and the president, the first vice president, and the secretary-treasurer from AFL-CIO were sitting in the gallery. And I asked the page to please take and deliver the cashier's check for $500 up to these three individuals sitting in the gallery. And I said, furthermore, and I pointed around to them, I said, I will not be intimidated at any price. After having told my colleagues on the floor of the Senate what had happened, delivering the $500 check up into the gallery with the page, I slowly sit down in my chair. My knees were black and blue from banging into each other. And I had people come and say, you know, I admire that, but boy, I won't be around here if I did something like that. And I said, you know what? If that's the price I have to pay, I don't want to be around here either. In September, in Seaside, Oregon that year, the president, first vice president, and the secretary-treasurer of AFL-CIO were defeated from office because of what had happened. When I hear people question the integrity of elected officials today, and I see people taking bribes and money that is not entitled to them, my heart grieves for that process. For I can honestly say in 30 years, I never took a dime that was illegal, immoral, unethical, or unprincipled in any way. And I never violated that trust. So the legacy I want to leave for my children, my grandchildren, and generations to follow is, follow your own heart. Follow your own mind. And do what's right. In 1975, I came in the 1974 election. It's called the Watergate class. There were 7 freshmen Democrats, and amongst those groups was legislators who had defeated longtime Republican legislators during the Watergate clearinghouse of the 74 election. If you'll recall, the 74 election that evening was like a tidal wave. It started on the East Coast, came all the way to the West Coast, and wound up in Hawaii and Alaska. But took off a lot of Republicans and replaced them with Democrats. And in the Senate there was 24 Democrats and 6 Republicans. And the Capitol wings didn't exist during the 1975 session. We all had offices in the old building. My office was up on the 3rd floor behind the Senate chamber. And in fact, there was a ladies' restroom upstairs, and every time somebody flushed the toilet, the water dripped down. So you had to run over there with a bucket to catch the water. But that was a living 1935 building in 1975. But during the 1975 to 1977 session, Jason Bowe was Senate President, and Phil Lang was Speaker of the House. And the legislature in '75 appropriated $1 to build the Capitol wings. So the Capitol wings were actually built for $1. They were built between the 1975 and 1977 session. And legislative administration and the leadership was all worried about paranoia of Watergate. And so they put lead foil between all the walls so that legislators couldn't overhear or couldn't bug conversations in other offices. And the first day we showed up for the legislature, they gave each one of us a key to our filing cabinet. And so I went out and tried my key on my filing cabinet, and it fit well, worked well. And the only thing was that my key fit the other 89 legislators' filing cabinets as well as mine. So in their zeal to deal with Watergate paranoia, they put lead foil on the walls but failed to recognize the uniqueness of the keys for all legislator file cabinets. So they had to go in and retool and rekey all the filing cabinets, and subsequently gave everybody a key to their filing cabinet. But there was a lot of rush to get in to the 1977 session. From 1977 till 2004, I was in the same office in the 3rd floor. And Jason Bowe was Senate President during that time. John Kitzhaber was Senate President during that time. Bill Bradbury, Fred Hurd, Ed Fadley were presidents of the Senate during that time. So I've had quite an interesting group. Gordon Smith, Brady Adams, of course Peter. So there's been quite a few Senate presidents I've had the privilege of working under during that time. First of all, I would say I hope and pray that the legislature does not ever change its original direction of a citizen legislature. That is the unique thing that Oregon has in its political structure, is that a housewife, a businessman, Joe Lunchbucket, an attorney, school teacher, can all serve side by side in the Oregon process. Length, duration, that has always been a subject. It was a subject when I first went there in 1975, and it hasn't changed over the years. But I would hope that before we do some knee-jerk reaction to a perceived problem on longevity, that we look and see what is it that we expect from our leaders. And when I look and see that only about 20% of the people are making the decision on who serves and who doesn't serve in the Legislative Assembly, then there's something wrong with our process. And you look at Iraq and other countries, and you look at 78, 80, 90% voter participation, there's something wrong with our system. So the first question I would ask is, what is it that you expect your legislators to do, and how do you want them to be? Until you've answered that question, until the public is prepared to answer that question. I was in the legislature when they went from voting at ballot boxes to vote by mail, and that somehow was going to make it easier and greater participation for people to participate in the election process. And the vote by mail hasn't. I mean, you can only make so much easy for people without them totally rejecting and saying, I choose not to participate. And so I would hope that, if anything, my colleagues in the legislature look at restoring that integrity that will reactivate public's interest in wanting to participate. Personally, I'd be opposed to it. And the reason I am is that Congress of the United States was like Oregon legislature. The 435 members of the House of Representatives was the people's house. You were not supposed to be a full-time congressman. You were supposed to be a full-time citizen who served in Congress. You look at the states that have gone to full-time year-round legislative assemblies. You need no look further south than the California border. Legislators there make $165,000, $175,000 a year per legislator. They have district offices. They have capital offices. They have staff in their district office. They have staff in their capital office. They have state vehicles to drive. I mean, start down that slippery slope. You just can't regain yourself. You just slide to the bottom. And if you look at these states that have gone to annual sessions, it started out with the best of intentions only to go awry. And so I would say, let's not go there. Well, Dixie and I are taking off this spring in 2006 to take an inland passage tour up to Alaska. We're hoping that possibly next year we can get the opportunity to go to Ireland, see some of my family over there. Recently I was appointed as a board of governor on the Shriners Hospital up in Portland. This is a 9-year commitment that I have pledged to my Shriners, that I will serve as a member of the board of directors of the Shriners Hospital. And so keeping busy. Have 9 grandkids to keep me busy. Have 5 kids and 4 in-laws to keep me busy. And so I'm excited. I'm looking forward to what the future holds. And because if the next 62 years are as good as the last 62 years, I'm looking forward to the future.
That's good.
I think that the people today are just as capable, or maybe even more so, than when we were there. It would just be my desire, my hope, that they tone down some of the political rhetoric and get to the issue and say, does this serve the public's best interest? And if it does, is my constituents going to benefit because of it? and because of my actions? And if it does, will I rise above politics to make sure that it achieves its objective? If you do those things, you'll be successful, and I wish all my future colleagues the best of luck in their endeavors as they start down this path.